Part 29. Welcome to our daily story. Please give me an idea if you listen. Don't forget to like and comment below. Something that could only be described as stupid. I had just showered, my damp hair was plastered to my neck, and the sweltering summer heat had given me no time to cool down. I stood in front of my closet, half-dressed, deciding between a loose, airy blouse and a tight top. The fan in my room did nothing to stop the beads of sweat rolling down my neck, making the decision more painful than it needed to be. I had left the door open. Why should I? My husband, Liam, had left for work hours ago, and his son, Kian, had just returned from his morning run. I could hear faint music coming from Kian's room through the thin walls. I had never even considered the possibility of someone walking in. That was when it happened. The door swung open abruptly. "Lorraine," Kian began, his voice catching mid-sentence. I turned, clutching the shirt to my chest, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. Kian froze in the doorway. His face was flushed, a color I had never seen on him before. His damp workout shirt clung to his chest, and sweat-soaked locks of hair stuck to his forehead. For a moment neither of us moved. Neither of us breathed. "Kian," I said hoarsely, my voice barely audible. "Sorry," he stammered, his voice hoarse as he backed away, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, paralyzed, clutching the shirt as if it could shield me from the humiliation that had just occurred. But it was more than just shame that burned my cheeks. It was something else. Something I didn't want to admit, even to myself. The days that followed were filled with uncomfortable silence. Kian avoided me at all costs, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced with short answers. He wouldn't look me in the eye at dinner, kept his head down, and kept interactions to a minimum. My husband, Liam, remained blissfully oblivious. Every interaction with Kian felt strained, as if we were both trying to pretend nothing had happened. But pretending didn't erase the memory. It didn't stop the scene from replaying in my mind at the most inconvenient moments, when I was folding laundry, making dinner, or lying in bed next to Liam. The memory was still there, like a stain you couldn't wipe away. I began to notice things about Kian that I had missed before. The way his shoulders had broadened since he moved home after college, the confidence in his stride that he hadn't had as a teenager. His boyish charm had matured into something calmer, more confident. But there was still a vulnerability to him, a vulnerability that almost caught people off guard. The atmosphere between us changed more than one quiet evening. As I stood at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables for dinner, Kian entered the room, his headphones draped loosely around his neck. I startled by his sudden request. As he moved closer, the kitchen seemed smaller, his presence impossible to ignore. The silence between us seemed heavier than usual, punctuated only by the rhythmic sound of the knife on the cutting board. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I froze mid-chopping, my breath catching in my throat. "Because of that day," he said, his voice even but tinged with regret. "You should have knocked. I didn't mean to." I tried to smile, hoping to ease the tension. "It's okay, Kian. Really. It happens." But it wasn't okay. And it didn't just happen. The memory lingered in our minds, refusing to be dismissed. As the awkwardness began to fade, something else began to replace it, a subtle, unspoken connection that neither of us acknowledged but both of us felt. Kian stopped avoiding me as he had before. Instead, he began to seek me out in small, discreet ways. He lingered in the kitchen while I cooked, offered to help around the house, or sat with me in the living room when Liam came home late. At first, I convinced myself it was all harmless, that I was imagining the way he looked at me a little longer, or the way he complimented me on how unusually thoughtful I seemed. "That color looks great on you," he said one evening as I was setting the table. The simplicity of his words should have made them seem insignificant, but the warmth in his voice made my heart race. The more time we spent together, the more I noticed him. His easy confidence, the way he carried himself, and even the faint scent of his cologne became impossible to ignore. Kian was no longer a boy. He was a man, strong, confident, and caring in a way that Liam hadn't been in years. One evening, after dinner, Liam announced that he had a late-night meeting. "Don't wait up for me," he said as he picked up his briefcase and left. The house was quieter than usual after he left. I was in the living room folding laundry when Kian walked in, carrying a bowl of popcorn. He sat next to me, close enough that our shoulders were almost touching. The faint hum of the television filled the silence as he flipped through the channels, eventually settling on an action movie. I tried to focus on the screen, but I couldn't ignore his presence, the warmth radiating from his body, the faint scent of his cologne. When I glanced at him, he was looking at me, studying my face with an intensity that took my breath away. I knew I should say something, do something to break the tension, but instead I just sat there, my heart pounding as I waited to see what he would do next. Nothing happened that night, but the moment stayed with me long after Kian had gone to bed. The way he looked at me, the unspoken question in his eyes, it was enough to keep me awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how we got here. It was a rainy evening when everything changed. Liam was away on a business trip, leaving the house strangely quiet. He emerged a few minutes later, flashlight in hand, damp hair plastered to his forehead. "Need help?" he offered, his voice calm but hesitant. I hesitated too, but nodded. "Sure, if you don't mind dealing with dust and cobwebs." He stepped into the loft, the small space instantly feeling smaller with his presence. As we worked side by side, sorting through boxes of forgotten Christmas decorations and old photo albums, I recognized him clearly. Every time he reached over or touched my arm, my heart sped up. At one point, I climbed onto a wobbly stool to reach a box on the top shelf. "Be careful," Kian said, standing behind me, his hands hovering near my waist as if ready to catch me. As I pulled the box out, the stool shook and I gasped. Kian's hands instinctively gripped my waist, steadying me. The warmth of his touch sent shivers down my spine. When I turned to thank him, I found myself facing him, his expression unreadable but intense. His hands lingered on my waist longer than necessary, and neither of us moved. Instead of pulling back, Kian's eyes flicked to my lips, then back to mine. The air between us was heavy, an unspoken tension that had been building for weeks. Before I could think, he leaned in, his lips meeting mine in a hesitant, almost questioning kiss. I froze, my mind screaming at me to pull away, to stop before this went any further. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back. The kiss deepened, and his arms tightened around my waist, pulling me closer. The boxes around us faded into the background, replaced by the heat of the moment. My rational mind screamed at me to stop, to think about Liam, the aftermath, the utter wrongness of it all. But in that moment, rationality no longer mattered. That night marked a turning point, the moment the fragile line we had always tiptoed across was completely breached. Neither of us spoke of it, but the silence between us carried the weight of everything that had just happened. We had crossed a line we could never break. The days after that night in the loft were strange, as if we were living in a dream that we both knew would eventually turn into a nightmare. Kian and I became bolder, finding moments to be alone. The secrecy, while exciting, also made every interaction feel like a ticking time bomb. Liam remained incredibly absent-minded, preoccupied with work and his never-ending list of responsibilities. He rarely asked where Kian or I were during the day, assuming that everything in the house was as normal as ever. But the truth was, normalcy had long since disappeared. The first crack in our carefully constructed facade came when my best friend, Natalie, dropped by unannounced. I was in the kitchen making tea when she walked in, her sharp eyes scanning the room as if she could sense something was amiss. My heart sank. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my tone betrayed me. Natalie shook her head, leaning against the counter. "Don't insult me, Lorraine. I've seen the way he looks at you. And I've seen the way you look at him." I stiffened, my teacup shaking slightly. "It's not what you think," I stammered. "Don't lie to me," she interrupted, her voice softer but no less serious. "You need to stop this. Whatever it is, it's destroying you." Her words lingered long after she'd left, but that wasn't the only warning sign. Kian's friend Adam came over one evening while Liam was away. He greeted me politely, but the way he glanced between Kian and me made me uncomfortable. "You two seem close," Adam commented casually, but his tone was a little harsh. I tried to laugh. "Just trying to keep him out of trouble," I replied, brushing off his comment. Adam didn't stay long, but his presence left a shadow over the room long after he left. That night, I asked Kian if Adam suspected anything. His silence told me everything I needed to know. Then the explosion happened, a plain white envelope left in our mailbox. Liam carried it inside with the rest of the mail, tossing it onto the counter without a second thought. I only realized it later, the weight of it making me feel uneasy in my hands. Inside were photos, blurry but unmistakable. One of Kian and me at the loft window. Another by the pool. Finally, the most damning, the one from the recording studio. My heart pounded as I looked at the evidence, my mind reeling. There were no notes, no explanations, but the message was clear, someone knew. That night, Liam came home earlier than expected, his face clouded with suspicion. He slammed the phone down on the counter and looked at me, his expression unreadable but fierce. I froze, my mind racing for an answer. Before I could respond, Kian entered the room. His expression told me he had been listening. "Maybe you can explain," Liam snapped, turning to Kian. "Your friends seem to think there's something going on in this house. Would you like to explain it to me?" Congratulations on watching the whole video. If you don't want to miss it, please like and comment below to watch the next video.